Hi. What I'd like to do now is to begin to teach the book of Exodus, but just to say that a lot of it is narrative, and therefore I don't think I need to spend time talking about that which you can easily read. What I want to do is just choose those things that I think would add to your own studies. And so when we come to chapter 1, I love the quote by Christopher Wright. Christopher Wright is a British Old Testament scholar, and I would recommend anything he writes. It's really excellent. But he says this: when you meet Israel in Exodus chapter 1, he says Israel was an ethnic minority community who had undergone economic exploitation, political oppression, and that eventually led to a state-sponsored campaign of terrorizing genocide. In other words, the oppression was cruel. As slaves, they had, of course, no political ability. They were not being paid for the work they were doing, and it eventually led to the murder of the male children. The cities that we read that they built, here is a map of them: Pithom and Ramses. Just to repeat the previous teaching, when we come to chapter 1, as far as we know, the Pharaoh of oppression is either Thutmose the First or Thutmose the Second, maybe both. Pharaoh's daughter was Hatshepsut. Great names, aren't they? That would mean that Moses fled from Thutmose the Third. Now, I've already mentioned how cities changed their names, even though one of the cities was Ramses. Pharaoh Ramses was of the 13th century. That doesn't mean the earlier date of the Exodus should not be considered. And again, in the last teaching, we looked at that. So the story, again, it's straightforward. Moses fled from Pharaoh after it became known he had killed an Egyptian, and he fled to the wilderness of Midian. And you'll see there a map. It's in today, it would be Saudi Arabia, the western part, and that seems to be where Moses had fled to. Now, we come to a marvelous part of Exodus, and that is the call of Moses. I think it's marvelous because we can resonate with so much of this. But just to say that Moses at this age was about 80 years old, we read that he was in Egypt until he was 40. He was a prince. He had the best education. It's the Jewish historian Josephus that records for us that Moses was an army general, and he had led the Egyptian army into battles in the southern part of Egypt and had victories. And so he would have been a very highly educated man, well respected in the courts of Pharaoh, and he would truly have been a prince. But it seems that he recognized his calling. As we read that when he came to two Jewish people fighting, and he encouraged them not to fight, and then that's when it became known that the fact that he had killed the Egyptian was public knowledge. It mentions there that they didn't understand that indeed God had called him to lead them out of Egypt. So just to say that there seems to be a sense of Moses' calling, or Moses having a sense of his calling, as the story shows, came to Midian, eventually got married and was living the life of a shepherd. We see it was 40 years in the palace of Pharaoh and 40 years in the tents of a shepherd. A tremendous contrast. And clearly, any idea that Moses had that he was God's deliverer had long gone from his mind as he was living his days looking after his father-in-law's sheep. And so we read in chapter 3 verse 6, when Moses encountered God at the burning bush, we read how God introduces himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. That would have connected Moses to his ancestral history, and God says that he's well aware of the misery of the people. And so when God calls Moses and says that you are the one to go and set the people free so that they should be led to a land flowing with milk and honey, which is, of course, an idiom of great prosperity and blessing and fruitfulness in the land. But what we find is Moses makes 5 excuses, and the first is in chapter 3:11, when Moses basically says, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" What is interesting is God's answer is very simple. In the next verse, God simply says to him, "I will be with you." As I've read the scripture, I've noticed that when God calls someone to do something and they have an excuse or a question, it seems that this is God's answer. I would like to say every time, but I haven't actually tested that. But I'm confident enough to say almost every time. This question arises that God's answer is simply, "I am with you." We think of Joshua, "As I was with Moses, so I will be with you." We think of Jeremiah, when he says, "I'm but a youth, I cannot speak." God says, "But I am with you." We think of the end of Matthew, when Jesus commissions the disciples, and his response is, "Lo, I am with you always." When Paul was in Corinth, and it was a very difficult time, the vision he had was simply, "I am with you." And friends, over and over again, when we meet a challenge, it seems that God's response is simply, "I am with you." In other words, God being with us is the answer and is all we need. But that didn't seem enough for Moses, because having heard that God was with him, his next response was, "But who are you?" And this brings us to a really big moment in the Old Testament where we get the name of God given, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I trust you understand that in asking this question, "What is your name?" Moses wasn't simply wanting to know the label that God went by, but rather it was to do with his nature and his character. And the response of God is so fascinating, because it's as if God would not be labeled. Now, remember, the gods of the Egyptians that Moses had grown up in a pagan society. The Israelites were involved in pagan worship, we learn, the gods of Egypt. And those gods, it wasn't that one God was all-powerful, but rather different gods had responsibility for different dimensions of society. There was a god of healing, or the god who caused the life-giving Nile to flow, or the god who brought fertility for children or crops or farm animals. There was a god who protected at sea or gave victory in war. And so you understand there were gods in the world view of these people. The gods had different areas of responsibility. And Moses was asking, what was God's name? And you see the incredible response is that God was not going to be labeled. He wasn't going to be put in a box. What is your name? My name is I am who I am. I am has sent you. Or as we would say today, Yahweh, the I am. Now, just to say that the way our Bibles represent this divine name is, as you see on the screen, the word Lord, only it's in capital letters. And there's a whole history behind this, but that is a convention. So every time you read the word Lord like that, you can substitute it if you want for Yahweh or the I am. Now, if I was to meet someone and I said to them, hi, I'm Phil, who are you? And they said to me, I am, I would be waiting for them to finish that phrase. And what I love about this introduction to God is the I am is in a sense that incomplete phrase, because the I am, Yahweh, as I said, will not be limited, will not be put in a box like the Egyptian gods, the god of the sea or the god of healing, because Yahweh is the God of everything. And right now, what Moses needed was God to be a deliverer. And what we're going to see in these next chapters, how God shows himself to be the I am of being a deliverer. And as you get further into Exodus, God needed to be the provider. And what you see is God, the I am, providing manna in the wilderness and water from the rock and other provisions. And so it's that this moment we get introduced to Yahweh and get a glimpse of the very nature and character of the all-powerful, all-knowing God of the Bible. Well, that was still not enough for Moses, because he said, suppose I go back to the Israelites and they don't listen to me. And you'll know that God graciously gives two signs so that Moses can prove himself. The sign of the snake, they may seem strange to us, but I'm assuming they had significance. Casting the rod down, it becoming a snake, and picking it up, and taking the hand and putting it in his coat and bringing it out, it's leprous, and then the reverse. But the idea was to give the Israelites an opportunity to respond in faith to what Moses was saying. And then Moses' complaint was, I cannot speak, I'm not a good speaker. Maybe he had a stutter or a stammer of some kind, we don't know. But again, God's response was, who made your mouth? I'm the one who made your mouth, and I can give you the words. And then the final excuse was this plea, oh God, please send someone else. And here we read that God was a bit angry with Moses and said, Moses, I'm able to do this for you. But in God's grace, he gives him Aaron to be a support and Aaron to be the spokesperson. And so you get this duo that in time was to be proved to be very powerful, and indeed Aaron was going to have a very significant role as the priesthood of ancient Israel was developed. And so the burning bush was the beginning of God's plan to redeem Israel. And so often in the Old Testament, when God wants to do something, he chooses a person. You see it way back when God called Abraham. You see it all the way through the Judges. You see it through the history books, the prophets. God uses people, and God empowers people to fulfill his purposes. And we read that the name of Israel's God, and that is Yahweh, the I am. And as I've mentioned, it's a gloriously incomplete phrase, because God is bigger than any phrase could describe him. And we're going to see more about this later on in Exodus. Now, we come to the plagues, and we come to the this phenomenon of the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. And as you've read Exodus, you will notice that sometimes it says that Pharaoh hardened his heart, and sometimes God hardened Pharaoh's heart, or I think once or twice his heart was hardened. And this has caused people to scratch their heads a little bit, because it seems strange that God would harden Pharaoh's heart, because if God hardens your heart, then there's no way you can do anything about it. Therefore, how can Pharaoh be responsible? But I think we need to take a step back and first of all have a look at chapter 3 verse 19. So we are still at the burning bush, and I want you to notice what God says to Moses. He says, when he's talking about deliverance coming, Moses coming and seeing the people delivered out of Egypt, what we read here is God saying, I know, however, that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Israel with all of my wonders that I will perform. And after that, he will let you go. And so I believe, friends, what we see is God was going to use Pharaoh's pride and Pharaoh's evil and his hard heart. He was going to use it for his own purposes. And we're going to see how he does that in a few minutes. But one thing we should not be doing is thinking that here is Pharaoh desperately wanting repentance, desperately seeking to be humble, desperately trying to turn from his wicked ways, and God coming in and saying, no, you can't do that, I'm going to harden you. That is absolutely not what's going on here. What we have is an evil dictator that for years has been cruel, viciously cruel to Israel. An arrogant man who was utterly not going to change. We read that God knew his heart and knew that he wouldn't change unless compelled by a mighty hand. And so what we see is God was going to use Pharaoh for his own purposes. Now, before we get to that, just a quick note on this very strange verse here, or verses should I say, in chapter 4. And that is when Moses and his wife and children had begun to make their way to Egypt. We read that they were camping one night, they had stopped to take their rest. And we read that the Lord met Moses and tried to kill him. Now, this is really, really strange. And I wish there was more information on these 3 verses, but we only get a very brief commentary. And what it seems, because Zipporah knew that the answer to Moses' problem was to have the 2 boys circumcised, the inference was that Moses knew about circumcision. It seems his wife was against circumcision, and therefore the boys had not been circumcised. And whatever was going on between God and Moses, Zipporah knew what the answer was. And her answer, truly, you are a bridegroom of blood to me. It would seem that that was the issue. And my understanding is that Moses was about to go back and to lead the people and to become what arguably is the greatest leader any people have ever known in history. If he was going to be that person, then he had to obey God in what was a really important area. Because remember, circumcision was a sign of the covenant that God had made between himself and the descendants of Abraham. And so I just suggest that to you as we have these verses that, as I say, are very strange. This indeed is how I've understood them. We see in chapter 6 a plan laid out. This plan was given to Israel. This is what Moses told the elders, and it is really laid out very clearly. Thus says the Lord to the Israelites, I am the Lord, I am Yahweh, I am the I am, and I will free you from the burdens of the Egyptians and deliver you from slavery to them. So part 1 of the plan is you're going to be free. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. That's judgment on the Egyptians that had been so cruel in their oppression for so long. I will take you as my people and I will be your God. That's part 2. God was going to adopt Israel as his own people. You shall know that I am the Lord your God. You shall know that I am the I am who has freed you from the burdens of the Egyptians. And then the third point, I will bring you into the land that I swore to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will give it to you as your possession. I am the I am, or I am the Lord, as we have in our Bibles. And so this was spoken out to the leaders and to the people. They knew God's plan, but it was going to take a lot for this to all happen. Lots of challenges. Now, we have the 10 plagues, and as we look at this, I want you to draw your attention to the reason for the plagues. And there seems to be 4 reasons. The first, you have the scriptures on the screen you can take down and look at, but just for the sake of time I'll read one of each. Chapter 6 verse 7, I will take you as my people and I will be your God. You shall know that I am the Lord your God who has freed you from the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will bring you into the land that I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So this verse that we've just read, what it's saying is God was going to introduce himself to Israel through the plagues. Now, remember, Israel had grown up in a pagan country, and we know from what happens later on that they were involved in worshipping these pagan gods. I'm sure they would have acknowledged the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob too, which was their ancestors' God. Yet nonetheless, they were involved in paganism and had pagan understandings. And what the plagues did was they made it very clear to Israel that God, Yahweh, the I Am, was truly the God of all gods and the God who had power over all gods. Now, let me just say this. We will see in a few minutes how these plagues, they were not arbitrary, but they were actually addressed to the different gods of Egypt. The Nile turning to blood was a direct confrontation against the gods that the Egyptians honoured as the Nile gods, this river that gave them so much life, and the same for the others as well. And so the plagues were these, if you like, confrontation with the Egyptian gods, and the God of Israel, the I Am, was proving had absolute authority over them. And this was a way of Yahweh introducing himself to this people that were pagan, to show them that he, the God of their fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, was indeed the one true God. Secondly, we read that God was making himself known to the Egyptians and declaring himself greater than their gods. In chapter 7, verse 5, having talked about the multiplication, the signs and wonders, we read, "The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, I am the I Am, when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring the Israelites out from among them." Now, later on in chapter 12, we read that when Israel eventually left Egypt, there was a mixed multitude. In what that means is that some Egyptians left with Israel. In other words, those people chose to follow the I Am. And so you have this spiritual warfare, if you like, whereby the plagues were declaring not just to Israel, but to the Egyptians that God, Yahweh, was the one true God that should be served. But more than that, it's like the circle widens. We read that these plagues declared to the nations that the God of Israel was the one true God. And we get, after the deliverance through the Red Sea, this song of Miriam, and we have in chapter 15, verse 14, "The peoples heard," that is the nations, "and trembled. Pangs seized the inhabitants of Philistia. Then the chiefs of Edom were dismayed. Trembling seized the leaders of Moab." Now, one of the fascinating things we read about in 1 Samuel chapter 4, when you get to 1 Samuel, you read how the Israelites were being plagued by the Philistines, and they had continual battles. And there's an account when the Israelites brought the Ark of the Covenant into their camp. And they did that. It was kind of a bit of a superstition, thinking that with the Ark of the Covenant in their camp, they would win their battles. But when that Ark was brought in, they let out such a shout and such a cry of joy and jubilation and hope and celebration that the noise was so loud that the camp of the Philistines heard it. And they said to their lookouts, "What's going on in the camp of the Israelites?" And the lookout said, "They have brought the Ark of the Covenant into their camp." And the response you read in 1 Samuel chapter 4 verse 8 is the Philistines responded by saying, "Oh no, this is the God that delivered the Israelites out of Egypt. This is that powerful God who did all those things to Egypt." Now, the fascinating thing is that incident in Samuel would have been round about 300 years or more after the Exodus. So in other words, the plagues and what happened to the Egyptians was known among the nations, that the God of Israel was a God who was greater than all gods. And then the last reason for the plagues is simply what it says in Genesis 15, when God is speaking to Abraham and saying that the people will come into the land of Egypt and be there for 400 years, they will be slaves. Then when they are delivered, we read in Genesis 15, it says that God will judge the people. And so very simply, there was the plagues were judgment on Egypt for the atrocities that were committed against Israel for many, many years. Now, we're going to read how God is slow to anger. We're going to read how God delays judgment. And that delay is always an opportunity for repentance. We read this in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. But there comes a time when judgment falls. And that is what was going on with these plagues. So just a quick survey. You can get this in Google and research it yourself if you choose. But just quickly to say that the blood turned to Nile would have been a statement against Hapti, the god of the Nile, and Anuket, the personification of the Nile, and Osiris, the supreme god of Egypt and the ruler of the dead. The frogs, Heket, the goddess of childbirth and fertility, Nu or Nun, the god of the Egyptian creation, and I don't have them here, but if you were to look these different gods up in images, you would find often that they would have the head of the particular thing. So the gods would be depicted with the head of a frog and these kind of things. Dust and becoming gnats or lice and flies. Set, the god of the earth. Set, the god of the desert. The death of the livestock and boils. Hathor, the god of festivity and love. Isis, the great mother goddess. Mu, god of the cataracts of the regions. And all of these cataract regions, should I say, that's a part of the Nile, all the way down the south of Egypt. And just to say, there's different connections with these gods and the different plagues. Thunder and the plague of hail and locusts. You get Nut, the goddess of the sky, and Osiris, the god of the underworld. And again, there would be these different connections with these gods to these plagues. Thick darkness, the Ammon king god, or Re, the sun god, and her symbolize the creativity of the power of the sun. And of course, the pharaohs were deified and considered to be the manifestation of the supreme god at death. And with the firstborn being taken, that was an attack against this understanding of Pharaoh himself being a god. And just to say, way at the very beginning, when Moses spoke to Pharaoh, he told him that this would be the outcome. And so there should have been no surprise. The Passover was another really big moment in Exodus. You'll be aware of this, I'm sure. In chapter 12:2, it becomes the first month because it was the birth of the nation. On that night, Israel went free. And it was a judgment of the gods of Egypt. And it was the judgment on Egypt, but the protection of Israel. And so the instruction is to celebrate it always, and it's kind of like their Independence Day. This is when they were set free. Many nations have Independence Day. Me here in the UK, we don't have one. The last time we were invaded was in 1066 by the French, William the Conqueror. But of course, many countries do, and sadly, many are celebrating independence for us. But that's history. This was Israel's Independence Day. And of course, the fact that the angel of death passed over those houses that had the blood on the doorpost becomes a vivid illustration, a vivid type of the work of Jesus. The Apostle Paul speaks about this in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. It talks about the Passover lamb that was slain so that the judgment would pass over. Very powerful symbol for us as New Covenant believers. And so finally they leave with great possessions. At the very beginning, when God spoke to Moses, he told Moses the people should ask the Egyptians for wealth. In fact, in Genesis 15, God says this to Abraham even. And so they left very wealthy. We read in chapter 12, they plundered the Egyptians. And as someone once said, they were simply getting 400 years of back pay, money that was owed them for the work that they had done. And so we read there are about 600,000 men. You add women and children, it would have been round about 2 million. And it was a mixed multitude. So as I've mentioned, there would have been Egyptians that had seen the power of Yahweh and wanted to connect with him, and they would have joined Israel as they left. The route of the Exodus, this is the traditional route, and of course Mount Sinai there in the Sinai Peninsula. I don't know whether you've had the opportunity to climb Mount Sinai. I've not had that opportunity, but many have that I know, and I've really enjoyed that. There are some today talking about a different route, and this is because it speaks about how they went to Midian, which was the other side there of the Red Sea, what today would be Saudi Arabia. And one of my friends who's very knowledgeable on this, he dismisses this alternative route. He says the timing doesn't allow such a journey. Maybe he's right there, but just to let you know, the argument has to do with the location of where the Israelites were trapped when the Egyptian army came after them. There is this place called Nuweiba. This is Google Maps. You can see how it fits a description that we have in Exodus, with the mountains all around on the three sides and the ocean in front, and there's only one way in. In other words, if the people were in this area of Nuweiba and the armies of the Egyptians were coming down that particular path, there literally would be no escape. Now, the other interesting thing is there seems to be below the surface a bridge. This is a topographical image there of that particular route from Nuweiba into Saudi Arabia, and you see the description there of the seabed of the Red Sea at this particular location. And so if the sea was to part, then it wouldn't be going all the way down to the bottom and up, but rather there would be a bridge across. What you see in the bottom right there is an image, and it's claimed that this is an underwater photograph from this area. It's actually a coral structure, but you'll see it looks very much like a wagon, a chariot wheel. And people say that the structure of this item here is in keeping with the chariot wheel structure of the Egyptians at this time. So I let you have that information. You can chase this up if you're interested. Maybe it means something, maybe it doesn't, but just to let you know that it's out there and people are discussing this kind of thing. So the deliverance of the Red Sea, it is the final deliverance. The Egyptians were finally cut off, and the Egyptians knew that Yahweh was indeed the all-powerful God. Let's just read chapter 14, verse 18. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I have gained glory for myself over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his chariot drivers. And so this was the final destruction of the Egyptian army. After this, they had nothing more to throw at the Israelites. We also read these marvelous words that in verse 31, Israel saw the great work that the Lord did against the Egyptians. So the people feared the Lord and believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. And so that was like a genuine connection, that the people understood that Yahweh was truly their God. And as we've seen in the song of Miriam, it wasn't just Israel, it was all the nations. Exodus shows, I think we can say quite confidently, that God is against oppression. God is a God who sides with the vulnerable, and a God who eventually will judge the oppressor. Now, so much more could be and probably should be said about this whole area, but to keep this video to a reasonable length, we will leave it there. We see God's wonderful provision. He could have taken them the route that goes by the Mediterranean. It would have been less than 2 weeks. They could have been in the promised land. But he took them the opposite direction, and we will see why. The encounter at Mount Sinai was really important, and we will explore that. But we see God's wonderful provision as this massive crowd of people are making their way through a very inhospitable area of wilderness, providing manna, providing water, obviously desperately needed. They had many herds, not just people, and God's provision was abundant for them and all that they needed. But they had to learn to trust him, and as you can read, that was a learning curve. The different complaints, God knew they needed manna. God knew they needed food. God knew they needed water. That wasn't a surprise to him. The sad thing was they complained rather than requested. The complaints came out of fear, came out of unbelief, came out of uncertainty, and the heart of God was that they would trust him, because every request they made was reasonable. It was reasonable to ask for water, reasonable to ask for food, and indeed God had every intention of providing for them. the sad thing was these things came out of complaints, which are out of unbelief rather than out of trust. There's the attack of Amalek. Now, Amalek was one of the nomadic tribes, and what they saw was a whole group of very wealthy, vulnerable refugee people, and that's why God's judgment was so strong against them, because they were exploiting this group of people. We get Jethro's advice. Now, this is Moses' father-in-law. He was a priest of Midian. And what we read is he acknowledged and honored Yahweh. And he acknowledged that Yahweh was the one true God. So he too was a believer. It seems that there were those who acknowledged Yahweh. We don't get too much evidence, but certainly some. And this God was about to adopt Israel as his very own people. And that's another big moment in Exodus. Exodus 19. We read that here God formally adopts Israel as his people. Let's read it. Chapter 19. We read how it begins with an affirmation of what God has done. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. What a lovely picture. On the basis of what I have done for you and what I have shown you, now he calls them into covenant relationship. Now therefore, if you will obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession, my unique people out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole world is mine, the whole earth is mine. But you shall be to me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. God wanted Israel to be his unique people, but his unique people among all the people that were his. And so in chapter 19 verse 6 we see Israel's commissioning. You see, a priest was a person who represented the people to God and God to the people. That was the priest's job. And what we wanted, what God wanted, was Israel to be his special people in the earth that represented him to the nations and the nations to him. In other words, in today's language, God wanted Israel to be his missionary people. He wanted Israel to represent him to the nations of the earth. This time now at Mount Sinai is a time when God brings about nationhood to this people. You see, when we think of Israel right now, they have been delivered from Egypt, so they were, like today, we would call them refugees. They had no instruments of nationhood. They had no particular laws. Today we would probably call it a constitution, how the nation should function, how the nation should be governed. They didn't have any of that. And what we read now at this time in Sinai from Exodus 19 through to Numbers chapter 10 and 11, this is the time at Sinai. This is the time when God instills in Israel, gives to Israel these instruments of nationhood. And if we want to think of all of the law, we have to think of really Exodus 20 all the way through to Numbers 36. Deuteronomy, as you're going to see, is a restating of the law to a new generation. But when it comes to this generation, this is a gift that God is going to give Israel. because right now at Sinai, he's going to prepare them for nationhood. Israel had no criminal or civil law, no system of justice, social system, i.e. Caring for the poor, needy and vulnerable, no military system, no economics system. What they were just rich refugees. And in these next chapters and books, God is going to give Israel an amazing gift, and that is his law. And that is going to become the basis of their nationhood.